Okay.
Oh,
All right,
okay.
we're good to go. We're good to go.
Okay.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Happy International Women's Day. And I am so delighted today that we have a special guest star. We have Dr. Marisa Richmond, a Nashville native who is here with us via Zoom. And she is going to be giving a talk called The Fight for Equality, Diversity Within the Women's Rights Movement. So before I do an introduction for her, I wanted to put in a quick infomercial for Women's and Gender Studies at UAB. We're an interdisciplinary minor. You can find us in the catalog, on Facebook, on Instagram. And I also wanted to thank the Institute for Human Rights and Waltina Josephat for helping us out here, and also the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. Anything you'd like to say, Dr. Blanton? Anything you'd like to add? No? Okay. So Dr. Richmond is a historian by training. She got her PhD in history from George Washington University. I looked up her dissertation. It's on presidential decision-making on space policy. Did I get that right? All right. But her work has digressed a little bit over the last few decades. So today she's more known for her scholarship and activism on transgender issues. And she's presently a professor of history and women's and gender studies at Middle Tennessee State University. She's active in Nashville and Tennessee politics. She has served and even chaired numerous coalitions, councils, collectives, and commissions, too numerous to mention. She's recently completed one term as the first and only African-American trans woman to serve on the Democratic National Convention. She, as I've mentioned, is noted for her scholarship and her activism on transgender issues. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Marisa Richmond.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm glad we could get together virtually. Wish we were in person, but you know, that's how things have been working the last 2 years. I guess it's been about 2 years since we went into the lockdown. So it's good to be with you, and especially on International Women's Day. Of course, if you, for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a day where we recognize and talk and work for a world free of bias, stereotypes, and discrimination. And many people have used the hashtag Break the Bias. Of course, International Women's Day has its roots in the Communist and Socialist Party movements. It was first recognized here in the United States in February of 1909 by the Socialist Party, although the date was set on March 8th in 1917 after the women gained suffrage in Russia, which obviously a country that's been in the news a lot lately for all the wrong reasons. And then the United Nations, it became more common in the U.S. In the 1960s and early 70s with the emergence of the women's rights movement, and then recognized by the United Nations in 1977. Of course, my title, the subtitle is Diversity Within the Women's Rights Movement. And so right here in the United States, the fight for women's rights certainly is as old as the nation itself. We recognize Judith Sargent Murray of New York, who as early as 1779, just 3 years after the writing of the Declaration of Independence, was openly advocating in New York for voting rights and property rights for women. Women were not allowed the right to vote and could not own property. Of course, a contemporary of hers was Abigail Adams. Her husband, John Adams, was a member of Congress and was one of the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And she famously admonished him to remember the ladies. And to his credit, John Adams did support women's rights, but he was in the minority at that time. The fight for women's rights in general, though, did take a back seat to the anti-slavery movement. Obviously, a nation founded on the principle all men are created equal, it seemed inconsistent and hypocritical to have slaves. In the 1830s, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, originally from South Carolina, began to write and speak out, equating the abolitionist movement with the women's rights movement, and felt that they believed that the two were linked, and that all forms of discrimination, whether based on race or gender, should be eliminated. But as women, and they were generally ignored, even within their own faith, the Quaker faith, who felt that women should not take political leadership roles at that particular time. A few years later, when a delegation of American women traveled to London to attend an anti-slavery convention, they were turned away at the door and told they could only sit in the balcony as observers. One of those in that delegation was Elizabeth Cady Stanton of New York State. She was insulted by the treatment that she and the others had received in London, and she eventually decided to organize a conference in her hometown of Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And this group was a mixed group of both men and women, blacks and whites, most notably including Frederick Douglass. But in general, contributions by black women were generally ignored at that time. My colleague in history, Nell Irvin Painter, has written a biography of Sojourner Truth, one of the most outspoken advocates for equal rights. And in her biography of Truth, Dr. Painter pointed out that Sojourner Truth was challenging the notion that black women should not be included, should not be treated as equals, with the famous phrase, "Ain't I a woman?" However, Painter can find no contemporary records of that statement actually being made by Sojourner Truth. And she questions whether or not she actually said it or not. But despite whether she did say it or not, the sentiment behind it was certainly something that Sojourner Truth was fighting for recognition of her femininity, of her identity as a woman, and deserving of equal rights, just as much as a black woman, just as much as white women were fighting for equal rights at that time, and felt that the voices and the perspectives of black women should be included in the movement. Of course, this the Civil War that finally did result in an end to chattel slavery in the United States, and we see the war followed by Reconstruction with 3 constitutional amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th provides for equal protection of the laws, and as I often point out to my students, it's the only part of the Constitution that has the word equal in it. And then the 15th Amendment is the Voting Rights Amendment. But those latter 2 badly split the women's rights movement. The 14th Amendment, which supposedly guarantees equal protection of the laws, also has the terms male citizens and male inhabitants, clearly leaving women out. So women were not included in equal protection of the laws. So in this case, all does not mean all. Then followed up with the 15th Amendment, which bans voting discrimination based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But despite the many decades of work dating back to people like Judith Sargent Murray, women were not granted the right to vote. And many were outraged at being left behind by these 2 constitutional amendments. So this led to a really bad split in the women's rights movement, and 2 major organizations resulted from that split. The American Women's Suffrage Association decided to endorse the constitutional amendments, and led by Julia Howe and Lucy Stone, they advocated for equal rights for the 14th and 15th Amendments, seeing them as important stepping stones to gaining voting rights and social equality for women. On the other hand, the National Women's Suffrage Association was insulted by the 2 amendments and vehemently opposed them. The organization was strictly white and excluded blacks, led by, ironically, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. And sadly, they employed some very racist terminology, saying that black men did not deserve the right to vote ahead of women, had not earned the right to vote yet, and sadly sort of appealed to racist sentiments among many women in the country. Despite this fact, in 1872, an Equal Rights Party was formed, and nominated the first woman, Victoria Woodhull of New York, to be president of the United States, and her vice presidential nominee was Frederick Douglass. So we actually see an integrated ticket, even though Victoria Woodhull was not allowed to vote in her own home state of New York. And famously, Susan B. Anthony was arrested for trying to vote in New York in that election as well. And it would take over 20 years to put these divisions to the side and to heal some of the wounds left behind by the split over those two constitutional amendments, when the two groups merged in 1890 to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association. By this point, the 14th and 15th Amendments were no longer being debated, at least in the public, although the courts were in the process of chopping away at those two amendments and leading to the rise of Jim Crow and laws of disfranchisement in the South. But women were now focused on trying to get voting rights specifically. Sadly, race continued to be a factor. In the North, the nativist movement, even among women, was important, as many white women said that if they got the right to vote, they could outvote the immigrants, most of whom were Catholic, although a significant number were Jewish on the East Coast and mostly Buddhist on the West Coast. And so they were employing these sort of nativist, xenophobic arguments there. Of course, in the South, the issue specifically focused on blacks. They were not challenging the poll taxes, the literacy tests, or the other forms of disfranchisement that were being introduced across the South. And as the battle for voting rights progressed, especially here in the South, there were real fears among many white voters that allowing black women the right to vote would lead to a return of Reconstruction. Reconstruction was being portrayed as a very negative experience for many Southerners, although not necessarily for black Southerners. And there was this fear that it would lead to a return of black political dominance, which we see to a limited degree in a handful of states like Mississippi and South Carolina, both of which had a majority black population coming out of slavery. And so the fear was that if black women could vote, this would lead to a return of black rule and a return of Reconstruction. So many of the Southern chapters of the National American Women's Suffrage Association just steered clear of the issue of race, or sometimes it would even, saying, we support white supremacy, sometimes even going to that extreme. There were, of course, exceptions. Here in my home state of Tennessee, Frankie Pierce out of Chattanooga was a key leader in the movement, and it was a critical decision was made by the women's rights leaders in the state of Tennessee to be inclusive of blacks. And Pierce out of Chattanooga was the key black woman in the movement fighting for voting rights. And so this finally led in August of 1920 to the state of Tennessee becoming the 36th state to adopt the Voting Rights Amendment, now known as the 19th Amendment. And finally, granting women the right to vote, although as we know, there continued to be major barriers, especially here in the South. Every single Southern state had poll taxes. Several states, like Alabama, had literacy tests. And I point out in the movie Selma, there was the classic scene where the old woman, played by Oprah Winfrey, went to try to register to vote, and the clerk there said, "How many county clerks are there in Alabama?" And she had done her homework and said correctly 67. And then he said, "Name them." And she picked up her stuff and turned and walked out because she knew she couldn't. And of course, Alabama even resorted to putting a jar of jelly beans on the table in front of a black voter and saying how many jelly beans are in the jar. And that was the so-called literacy test, as if knowing how many jelly beans are in a jar has anything to do with voting. But once the Voting Rights Amendment, so those barriers continue specifically for black women, especially in the South, although as the Great Migration was taking place and more women, blacks in particular, were moving, and black women were moving to the North, some were now gaining the right to vote. Of course, with the adoption of the Voting Rights Amendment, which does address that, that barrier left behind by the 15th, the focus now shifted to the Equal Rights Amendment to address the loophole from the 14th Amendment, which again stated male citizens or male inhabitants, so providing an exception to equal protection of the laws. But during this time, Congress was in no mood to support equality. In fact, again, continuing to support anti-immigrant legislation in particular. The creation of the National Organization for Women in 1966 helped us enter a new period. It was designed to help push for that Equal Rights Amendment. But with the burgeoning LGBTQ rights movement coming out of the civil rights movement, like with so many other groups, this did make many women in Middle America very uncomfortable. Many had grown up with relatively conservative values, did not want to acknowledge sexual diversity within the movement. But there were advocates within the movement, like New York attorney Florence Kennedy. She pushed the envelope by being openly lesbian and an advocate for sex workers at a time when many women's rights advocates didn't want to deal with either one of those issues. Kennedy, who was also Black, helped expose homophobia and classism, along with the racism, which had long been a part of the movement, and exposed it within the movement, as she argued for equitable treatment of all women, in some way sort of hearkening back to that phrase attributed to Sojourner Truth, whether she said it or not, "Ain't I a woman?" and arguing that all women should be treated as equals. Excuse me a second. Again, these attitudes had always been there, but for years they've been overshadowed by racism, anti-Semitism, and xenophobia. Of course, the adoption of Title IX, which I think we're just about to celebrate the 50th anniversary this year. This helped provide for equitable funding of women in education, and certainly there continue to be many barriers for all women, Black, white, and other groups as well. And that's why I think a lot of women, grew up, if they did go to college, they were asked, well, when are you getting your MRS degree, as if that was the only thing that mattered. And it's amazing to me when I mention that, all the women nod in understanding, and the men are going, "What's an MRS, Masters of Religious Studies?" I'm like, "No, sorry, that's no." They don't get it. And in one sense, it's good they don't get it. In another sense, it's sad that they aren't studying history and don't understand the many barriers that so many women have faced. But of course, Title IX, even though it's specifically an education focused law, part of its mission is to provide for equitable funding of women in sports. And there was a long fear of lesbians in sports, that the only women who wanted to play sports were lesbians. The role of advocates and leaders like Billie Jean King has helped in acknowledging the existence of lesbians and bisexual women in sports and popular culture in general. It's interesting that with the recent arrest of Brittany Griner in Russia, everybody's acknowledging she is a lesbian. She's out and proud of that, and at least people are acknowledging that and saying that is part of. They believe that may be part of the reason she was arrested. That this is political persecution. Anyway, the latest dividing line in the recent years has been the obsession over trans women in society in general, and especially in sports. Even though way back in the 1930s, Stella Walsh of Poland won gold medals in the Olympics, but that was long before she was out of the closet, and she wasn't revealed to be trans until she passed away in I think in 1980 was the year. But the legal challenges of Dr. Renee Richards in the 1970s is different, because she was outed by the media and then decided she wanted to play in the U.S. Tennis Open. And she was forced to go to court to fight for the right, which she eventually won. But even then, some 45 years ago, when Dr. Richards' case was going through the courts, people were saying that if she was allowed to play women's tennis, this would lead to trans women being dominant. That all these mediocre male tennis players and other athletes would change their gender so that they could play sports and win championships. And here we are 45 years later, and not a single sport, tennis or any other sport for that matter, has been dominated by trans women. If they were mediocre on the men's side, they turned out to be mediocre on the women's side. But this latest obsession over trans women in sports has also sadly split the women's rights movement. We have seen in tennis Margaret Court, who actually won the Grand Slam in 1970, and nobody said that that the rules favored Australian women at that time. She was just simply good and deserved to win. But she has been outspoken in opposing trans women, and most notably the author J.K. Rowling of the Harry Potter books. And they symbolize a group of women known as the trans exclusionary radical feminists, or TERFs. Their patron saint was an author, Janice Raymond, who wrote a book in 1979 called The Transsexual Empire. And in this book, Janice Raymond attacked trans women, saying they were just simply surgically constructed and did not recognize trans identities as legitimate, did not recognize trans women as women. And many of those like Margaret Court and J.K. Rowling are simply repeating many of the sort of claims that Janice Raymond made back in 1979. They don't see any irony in denying equal opportunity to other women based on their gender, because again, they don't recognize the legitimacy in the same way that Sojourner Truth and others were fighting up, saying that Black women deserve the same rights as white women, and that other groups were saying that Jewish and Asian and Catholic women deserve the right to vote like any other group of women. So these arguments certainly, especially at the federal level, have been used against the extension of the Violence Against Women Act, which currently is inclusive of lesbian, bisexual, and transgender women, and passage of the Equality Act, which would finally sort of put enforcement into law, the language of both Title VII, which bans sex discrimination in the workplace, as well as Title IX. And so it would kind of go and provide additional enforcement to both of those laws, and go even further. But of course, we see numerous states around the country are still passing a number of laws, and some women are advocating for these bills. In fact, already this year, 2 anti-trans sports bills have been signed by women governors in Iowa and South Dakota. And both those governors said that they were signing these bills to protect women in sports. Again, because of their refusal to acknowledge the diversity of women in society. Despite the progress, these divisions do have a long history. And at the present time, they show no sign of dissipating. But many advocates are still out there in states all over this country, from all categories. There's been a lot of progress made, again, especially since the end of the Civil War, and certainly since the end of or the adoption of the 19th Amendment, which we're now up on 102 years. I guess we had the anniversary right smack in the middle of COVID. But despite this, the fight for equality goes on. The diversity is certainly, as the way in which we view diversity has changed over the last 100 years. Those challenges remain. But I do continue to believe that progress is possible. I am optimistic despite the challenges. As you know, as an historian, I know that anytime a group demands equality, demands their seat at the table, and Shirley Chisholm famously said, if they don't have a seat for you, bring a folding chair. And a lot of people are trying to do just that. And some people don't want them at the table, but there are others who are saying, yes, we have to have everybody. And it's those voices of inclusion and of equity who are making a difference, and why, despite these current bills and this backlash, why I do believe the future is a good one, and why equality is something that for everybody, truly equal protection of the laws, I think truly will be achievable one day. And so I think I've been talking for right around 30 minutes. I don't know how much time we have for Q&A, but I thank you for your attention. And if there's a way to take some questions, I'm more than happy to do so. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond. I'd like to, as far as the attendees go, there's a Q&A prompt at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you could just post your questions there, and I'll get them to Dr. Richmond. Dr. Sharlock had some questions that were submitted to her before the event started, and I thought while everybody's getting questions together, we could go through, ask you some of those questions.
Sure.
What advice would you give to any trans youth who is contemplating a career in politics?
Absolutely. Oh yeah, I love that. Get involved in a campaign. This is an election year. We got elections all over the country. Congress. Here in Tennessee, we got a governor's race. We don't have a Senate race at the moment. Obviously, state legislatures, school boards are particularly important, and many communities have elected school boards. Here in Tennessee, we're also electing all of our judges this year. They serve 8-year terms, so this is the year all the judges are up, and we've seen, for other reasons, watching a number of important trials around the country, how important judges are. Good judges, I think, will result in good decisions by juries, and bad judges can lead a jury astray. And I think we've seen a couple of cases where that's occurred. And so young people, I got involved in a campaign when I was 12. My best friend's mother was running for mayor. And so I started going into the headquarters and stuffing envelopes and passing out literature in the neighborhoods. And, you just kind of work your way up from there. And there's all sorts of things. I remember one candidate a few years ago said, if I have to choose between volunteers or donors, I'd rather have volunteers. And so, and although if they can pay you, they will. And at the very least, they'll feed you. and I remember as a young person that free food was always a good attraction.
Could you tell us what first got you into politics?
Well, my parents were politically active. They took me to the voting booth. I got to flick the buttons. I was just exposed to it. My mom took me. I'm giving away my age. My mom took me out to see President Kennedy, and I didn't know what the president of the United States did. I just knew he was on TV, so that made him important. And I've just been a political junkie ever since.
Dr. Sherlock, I think you might have had another question or two that came your way.
Right. Well, one question is just for young people in general, have you found being a delegate a rewarding experience? Did you find being a delegate a good?
Oh yeah. I've been a delegate 3 times, 2008, 2012, and 2020. And 2020 was virtual, but the other two times we were in person in Denver and Charlotte. Of course, Denver, that was the year we nominated Barack Obama. And so just, the networking, I call it the Olympics for political junkies. It's you meet people from all over the country who are engaged. You get to hear some wonderful speakers, and you go to all sorts of parties and receptions and meetings, and you're rubbing elbows with important people, and you're there because you're important. They're there because they're important, and it's just such a heady experience. And I encourage everybody to think about running to be a delegate.
One question from one of our attendees. In terms of international politics, have you done any activism at the international level, or are there any particularly interesting things going on?
Well, I know I've met people who have. Here, Tennessee is hard enough without trying to take on, issues in Europe or Asia or Africa. So there are other people I know. I've met people who are in Europe who are activists. I know people who work in New York with the United Nations. So those people are doing important work, but I have not been involved.
If I could ask another question here. I know that the Nashville area is mighty whitey, right? I know that's why the American Renaissance Conference is held there, because the white nationalists want to turn it into a white ethno-state and all that. And I'm struck in Tennessee by the prevalence of Confederate monuments and all that. To what extent is the Daughters of the Confederacy still a political force there? And do you think there's any way of winning them over to reason?
Well, I don't know how powerful they are. I know that there's a lot of pro-Confederate sentiment. The state legislature passed a law that requires any name changes to go through the historical commission, and to date, they've turned down every single request. At MTSU, we actually have a Nathan Bedford Forrest Hall, which ironically is the ROTC building. So that's the Army facility named for a man who massacred U.S. Army troops. And we can't get rid of the name because, the university has requested it several times and we keep getting turned down. So, I know Vanderbilt had some issues. They were able to change a building name because they're not part of the state. It's a private university. And so they actually had to return money to the United Daughters of the Confederacy. They did not want, to take the money. They didn't want the name removed, but Vanderbilt said, we're getting rid of this name. And so they took that action. And a lot of schools are doing that around the country. I don't know if Tennessee, I haven't looked at the numbers. I don't know if Tennessee has more monuments than any other state, but certainly our legislature has taken steps to try to protect those names. How much direct influence the United Daughters of the Confederacy has, I don't know. I don't see them changing their mind, especially when I saw how angry they were at Vanderbilt. Even though Vanderbilt says, we're giving you your $1 million back, they didn't want to take the money, but so you can sort of interpret that however you want to.
You said Tennessee was busy and eventful enough. How are things going in Tennessee this legislative season?
They've been challenging. There's, aside from just the normal, let me say, last year, they passed 5 anti-LGBT bills, 4 of them transgender specific. And there were only 8 anti-trans bills in the whole country. So Tennessee alone had half of them. This year, they're going after education. They already banned critical race theory last year. And I point out to my students, and I'm teaching African American history, I'm not teaching it. That's a law school class, and I'm not even teaching it. Never mind K through 12. But Now they're going after LGBTQ curriculum, not just K through 12, but even higher ed. And they've got like a couple of bills that target us at the college level. And so they would make me a criminal, in effect. They're targeting libraries, and several schools boards have tried to ban books. Like one got national attention, the book Mouse, about the Holocaust. And so it's become really frustrating to fight these battles. We're hoping that maybe they've gone too far, but we'll just have to see what happens in the elections this November.
I think one of us froze up. I've got a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you fine.
Cool. Got another question from one of our students here. Can you comment on the recent elections of transgender candidates across the country, as well as the transgender caucus in the Democratic Party?
Well, I'm excited by all these people running and getting elected. We during the convention 2 years ago, we had our biggest number of delegates. I think we had 34 of us. And so, I'm seeing more and more people running and winning. They're running credible races, so that's good. As far as the transgender caucus, right now there's only 2 people on the DNC, although a number are getting involved at the state and local level in their parties. So there is an LGBTQ caucus, but you need more than 2 to add. We called ourselves a caucus during the convention 2 years ago, but again, we're not officially recognized yet because we don't have enough on the DNC itself.
Okay, I think we're freezing up here a little bit. A little bit of Zoom delay here. I think we have another question in from the students here. A student asks, what advice would you give a college student going into politics studies?
What advice? Like I said a few minutes ago, start by getting involved in a campaign. There's lots of campaigns. That's how you learn how it's done. That's how you meet people. That's the best way to make contacts and connections, is to get involved in a campaign. Some of them pay. I've had paid positions in campaigns myself. So,
what's your take? I mean, the theme of your presentation is sort of diversity within the women's rights movement, within the fight for equality. I'd like to hear more about how the interfragmentation of the women's rights movement could be overcome. Because as you talked about, it's been kind of hit and miss throughout the entire history.
Yeah, well, as we've moved through these periods, as different groups emerge and become more visible, obviously there's always a backlash. And, I think as we've become more inclusive, as we've accepted that diversity, I think the women's rights movement is stronger, that we put aside those differences. We recognize that diversity is actually a positive. It's not a negative. And as more and more people embrace that idea, I think the movement has made progress.
Could you tell us a little bit? I'm always curious in terms of how you talk to the policymakers, and I think a lot of students don't really get, like, if you disagree with someone politically, you can still have a conversation with them. Could you tell us a little bit about how you operate in those terms?
Well, I guess it depends on the specific policy. Especially if it has anything to do with education, I bring my personal experience and background into it. If it's in another area, I try to provide information, some studies, it's done things like healthcare, for instance, access to healthcare. I think that should be a basic human right, an American right. And sadly, it's not. But I think that we need to sort of focus on taking care of people. And of course, I quote the Constitution. Again, equal protection of laws hasn't always been the case, but it's there in the Constitution. And if we talk about loving the Constitution, then you can't just ignore it.
That is a nice way to sort of try to get common ground, right? Find something forward on. Okay, I can go with that. Dr. Sherlock, I think, did you have any more of your advanced questions?
Let's see. I was going to ask about the recent anti-trans backlash in the schools, and what do you think is the best way to approach that?
Well, the students all over the country, especially in Florida, we're seeing them really coming out and protesting. I like what they're doing in Florida, speaking out. I know in Texas, where the governor is talking about trans parents are committing child abuse. It's the legislators who are committing the child abuse, in my opinion. We're starting to hear stories of families saying we're leaving Texas. And, and that's it. My mom was from Texas, and I always loved going to visit my grandparents. And it's sad to see people abandon Texas. But young people increasingly need to speak out and get involved and get organized. I think that's the best way.
And just to add on to that, the whole trans bathrooms issue, do you have a similar prescription for that? Or?
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. A few years ago, we had a version that applied to colleges. And I pointed out that my office was directly across the hall from the bathroom. So I would have been the bathroom police. I'm not exactly what they had in mind. And but I also, again, I quote the 14th Amendment, and they didn't like me quoting the Constitution. And of course, they want to keep us out of education. They don't want us to be educators. But we're there. And, those doors are creaking open slowly. But it also helped, we went out and we reached out to lots of different groups, especially other educators, the Tennessee Education Association, to lobby against that. They're like, we have so much to do and we don't want to do all this paperwork. And I think the legislators were caught by surprise by some of the arguments that we were raising. And the sponsor said there'll be no enforcement. Right after I testified, I'm going to have to figure out how to enforce this. And so she had no, real understanding of how schools operate.
Thank you.
Thanks. What's your take, this is a good day to kind of assess the future of sort of the women's rights movement. And currently, Roe v. Wade is really under fire. What is your take about all the threats to that, and where do you see things headed?
We're very concerned. Today of all days, our state legislature, I haven't seen what happened, but they debated a Texas-style bill and kind of sprung it up surprisingly. And a lot of women's rights advocates in Tennessee are furious over that, that this was insulting to bring it up on Women's International Women's Day. And they said, all we can do is hope for the best from the Supreme Court, and everybody's waiting on that ruling, which should be coming out in a few weeks. And just I think, and in Knoxville, the Planned Parenthood building was burned down a few months ago, and then it was defined as an act of arson. So someone intentionally burned that building down. So everybody is concerned about this and what that Supreme Court ruling is going to lead to.
Yes, I hate to get things too far down sort of the defensive and negative level. These are the times in which we live. What on Nashville? Is there anything in Nashville that sort of gives you some hope?
Well, in Nashville, we have a non-discrimination ordinance. Mm-hmm. A lot of the businesses, we've had a lot of people moving in, and almost every major business has adopted a very solid policy themselves. And they're reaching out to the trans community, and they're involved in Pride. And so those are the sorts of things that give me hope. All of the politicians are reaching out to the community, asking for votes. And especially this year, I'm getting a lot of them saying, will you endorse me? And, there was a time when, a Black trans woman giving a public endorsement was not even considered. And now, and I won, and that's good.
So a lot of the stuff that we talk about in political science and then at the IHR deal with more international things. So I know you're primarily more of a state operative. What lessons would you give to someone in a country where rights for transgender people are just emerging?
Well, there's a lot of that, especially in Africa, it's being done. And, one of the things, especially when I teach my classes, talk about the fact that we've been part of every culture throughout history, and that these other countries need to recognize their own history. Sometimes they've turned their backs on them. Part of that's the legacy of colonialism, and they act like that this diversity was brought in during the colonial period. And in fact, just the opposite is true. It's the colonial period that tried to suppress it. And so, trying to help them understand their own history, I think, is critically important. And the people who are doing that work, it's a lot more dangerous for them than it is for us here. And I recognize that, and I applaud those people who are stepping up.
Great. Well, thank you. Does anybody have any last minute questions that they'd like to ask? Dr. Richmond, do you have any concluding thoughts? Or
I just want to thank you all for this opportunity. I really appreciate this. This is it's been fun, and I hope your audience has enjoyed it, and because I certainly have.
We did, and thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond.
Thank you.
Stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Happy International Women's Day, everybody.
Yes. I think this is the salute or something like that.
Looks like the Macarena, but yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.